Hi there. It's an honor to be here today. I've really learned so much from hearing all the other speakers. In my day job, I study use and abuse of current information technologies, which is a vast purview spanning everything from mis and dis to trust and safety issues to how emerging technology changes the playing field. And what I'm specifically tasked with is understanding how the worst people in the world abuse the best technology or the most productive technology, right? And so one of the things I think a lot about are how do we have something that can be a tool in one person's hands but a weapon in another person's hands, and how do we think about the balances and the trade-offs? And so I was asked to speak today on those trade-offs, which is a very, very complicated, thorny topic, and to do it in 15 minutes. So. I'm sure that anyone here attending a privacy, a conference related to privacy and to cryptocurrency has a very strong opinion already, right? And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as we try to thread this needle and understand this distinction between privacy and security are the idea of defaults, right? And how do defaults shape systems? So defaults are a function of the design of a system. They can have a pretty profound impact on how a technology is adopted and how a technology is used. And sometimes this can be relatively innocuous, but sometimes it can be a little bit more impactful. So we have certain defaults that serve as nudges, that nudge people to behave in a certain way, or that inspire people to take a certain action, produce a particular type of content, form connections with particular types of people. And sometimes those nudges come about because they create a very low-friction way to interact with a system. So sometimes the people who are most attracted to the product are those who are attracted to it kind of based on the default settings. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is the most kind of productive setting for the system in the long run, and so this is one of the areas that really, as anybody who's watched the conversation about social media in particular come about, is things that really didn't seem like that big of a deal 10 to 15 years ago, now we're kind of forced to reckon with, right? A technical debt that maybe becomes kind of a social debt. We can maybe summarize the dynamic as the devils and the defaults. So defaults have begun to change pretty significantly in the privacy space. Encryption is increasingly becoming the default mode of online conversation, how we chat, how we connect with each other. There's no longer a need to be a security geek, right? It's just embedded in the apps that we use today, privacy by design, privacy by default. And so the apps are both effortless to use, and they're readily available to mainstream audiences everywhere in the world. So this is a profoundly powerful shift. When I was a VC, Brady alluded to this, this was around from 2011 to 2014. And privacy was much more of a niche area. It was not a thing that people were really making investment decisions on. Very few startups came into our offices with pitches about making it harder for companies to see what you were talking about or where you were. The prevailing vision of the future was quite starkly the opposite, actually. It was the idea that you were going to be out and walking and your phone would push you a coupon. Right? You would have a serendipitous experience. You're on this block, this store is here, here is your coupon, come on in, right? And you would use connected wearables, and they would upload your health information to your doctor automatically. Now, maybe some insurer somewhere was going to buy that data in bulk, anonymized, of course, and you were going to have perhaps like a discount on your premiums or something like that. There was this idea that perhaps there was some give back in exchange for you giving up this information. Your refrigerator would be smart, it would be connected, it would automatically ping your grocery store. It would tell your grocery like when you were low on milk so that you didn't have that horrible experience of being out of milk. We would all have drones. They would follow us around. They would be smart. We would just kind of use them constantly. They would be everywhere. Your financial transactions relevant to this, they would be aggregated. So again, companies and firms could push you discounts and services and lower rate loans. And data exhaust was the term that we used in venture capital to talk about this. There we go. Okay, so I was curious how widespread that term still was today, about eight years, almost 10 years now later. So I Googled it, and I don't think it really is anymore. I don't think it's a thing that is quite so much part of the zeitgeist. But Wikipedia had a very nice definition that I felt was kind of a relic of the times. And it said, unlike primary content, these data are not purposefully created by the user. There's no intention there. The user is often unaware of their very existence. So this is a way to monetize you inadvertently. You don't know what you're putting out there. You're not aware of how the default of the system is potentially working against you. But the focus of the attention and on the funding dollars was on what could be done for you with your data exhaust, and of course the startups pitching this vision of a world of monetized data exhaust would in theory profit, either from their own data mining, or by aggregating across their sort of, this was always theoretical, everyone would come in and tell you that they were going to monetize and no one really had an actual plan. But they would kind of theoretically sell that anonymized data to other companies, to insurers and the like, and privacy was decidedly not the default. So I'm going to read a quote here from a William Safire New York Times article from 2002. Every purchase you make with a credit card, every magazine subscription you buy and medical prescription you fill, every website you visit, an email you send or receive, every academic grade you receive, every bank deposit you make, every trip you go on, every trip you go book, and every event you attend, all these transactions and communications will go into a virtual, centralized, grand database. So that was 20 years ago. And the public at the time, and Congress, candidly, was horrified by the very idea. Because that article wasn't about big tech, it was about a DARPA program by the name of Total Information Awareness. That program was broached shortly after September 11th, and it sought to link disparate data sources to identify indications of radicalization or terrorist activity, both things that are actually very real threats, but the grand vision, this unified database that would encapsulate everything that you ever did, was rightfully seen as something horrible, as the kind of Big Brother realized, the panopticon brought to life. The program was broached, though, in the interest of defense and of security. So there was this kind of noble motivation, this idea that perhaps we should be thinking about security and finding terrorists before it's too late, kind of a relic of the times. But that degree of Big Brother was horrifying to the public and to Congress, and we made a decision as a society that privacy was clearly more important than that theoretical security trade-off. But interestingly then, there was this sort of slow creep in which for many years, users did not seem to have too much of an issue with the idea of private companies doing that exact same thing. There was a value proposition. To the tech companies amassing the data couldn't arrest them, and they got their coupons. They got to use some cool apps, they got some things for free, and arguably, the users did not fully understand what they were giving up. Nobody really reads the terms of service after all, but even then, there were some cautionary articles about creepy tech and various privacy activist efforts to get people using encrypted tools or browsers or search engines that wouldn't track their users. But one of the reasons that nobody cared about platforms amassing user data for a very long time was because that was how the defaults were designed. Sure, sometimes you get a pop-up about data collection, but it was very easy to click that OK button to keep moving along to what you actually cared about, sharing your pictures and engaging with your friends. Another reason, though, was at the time, and through up until around 2017, the tech companies had enjoyed a fairly high degree of public trust, far higher than this degree of trust, of Big Brother and the government. When that started to change, ironically, the radicalization and terrorist recruitment that government platforms had been so concerned with detecting through this kind of sifting of offline, real-world transactions actually did in many ways move online. And so all of a sudden, the very platforms that had accomplished that degree of data collection that had so horrified the public when we thought about the government doing it, now had to start mining their own data and looking at their own networks to try to find the sources of radicalization and the dangerous orgs and the inauthentic individuals and the kind of litany of harms that kind of came about because of a system that had been built to connect everybody very efficiently without necessarily thinking about trade-offs or particular functions that engendered particular network creations and the development of relationships. And so ultimately, they found themselves in a situation where they ultimately became responsible for finding the people who were misusing platforms largely enabled by the very systems that they had designed. So, big tech's design defaults and data capture had by this point really reshaped society. And a pushback began, at first from media and activists, but gradually it came to incorporate a far broader community. And there's now widespread awareness of the fact that everything that we do is instrumented and analyzed, and a fatigue has set in. A recognition that perhaps we've moved into a technological epoch in which we gave up too much privacy, that the data exhaust was actually creepy, and that we had tilted too far in giving up that information. And so now there's pushback, a movement more into deliberate anonymity, or at least persistent pseudonymity, a rethinking of the defaults. Signal use is growing, WhatsApp use is widespread. Privacy is a hot topic across all sectors of technology, as people are making much more conscious choices about what they want to expose. But while I think that's a net positive, I'm also going to offer perhaps an unpopular provocation, because I do think there's also the risk of absolutism creeping into that conversation as well. And there's an interesting kind of scope creep, a rhetorical reclassification of every technology in a binary. It's either wholly private or intolerable surveillance. And I'm being a little bit reductive because I've only got 4 minutes left, but there's a social cost to absolute privacy as well. And there are devil in the details trade-offs that as we move into the new epoch, we need to be thoughtful about as we design these systems. Never before in history has right to privacy been thought to encompass a right to absolute anonymity, even in physical public space, even in financial transactions. So we're moving into a much more novel territory. And this is not an argument for a return to some halcyon days of trusting the government, that they're doing the right thing, or to a state of tech platforms strip mining attention for monetizable dust. But I do think that as we change the defaults and as we nudge people towards end-to-end encrypted apps and purely private transactions, that we do have to think adversarially in ways that we weren't doing as we built the systems of corporate surveillance and mass data gathering that so many prior speakers have spoken about today. Because there is this very real risk of actual authoritarian regimes surveilling the public. There is dissidents being disappeared. There's abuse of citizens. There's also very real harms that are significantly helped along by effortless anonymity, like terrorism, like child exploitation, like money laundering. And so one of the things that's been so appealing to me about watching MobileCoin develop has been this thoughtfulness among the team and a desire to really see that expanded to the broader community as a whole. So how do we thread the needle between creating privacy-protecting defaults while being cognizant of potential downstream harms? So societies balance this private sphere and public order trade-off across any number of issues. And Josh is fond of the phrase, only Siths speak in absolutes. So we don't want to be speaking about these things as if we're always imminently at the precipice of a descent into tyranny, or fear-mongering about small numbers of users who abuse the system, ruining it for the rest of us. And so any technology has that tool-weapon dichotomy, and the question now for us is really, how do we think about the guiding principles that will inform these trade-offs? So a couple of colleagues of mine at Stanford have been thinking about privacy in the context of end-to-end encryption in messaging, where the adoption and mainstreaming is imminent, where it's already happened, you could argue, and where platforms are now making decisions about defaults today that have profound consequences. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is Facebook, for example, and the rollout of end-to-end encryption across all product surfaces. Is that a thing that we should be doing? Where are the trade-offs in that system? Is there a difference in WhatsApp being end-to-end encrypted and Signal being end-to-end encrypted as opposed to something like Messenger or Instagram messages? Is it different when we are thinking about privacy and an interaction between two people in which we know each other and we're choosing to engage, versus a system in which the platform has an incentive to connect you with more people, including potentially people who are in fact manipulative and harmful, particularly in the context of some of the work that's come out recently on Instagram DMs and teenagers and children. And so in order to balance privacy and security for these users, you could really argue that Facebook needs to be doing more to assess the metadata to identify deliberate abusers so that others can continue to use the technology safely. And that's the kind of trade-off that we're starting to see in the end-to-end encryption space, but several years after the sort of mass adoption, and so a lot of it is being really tacked on after the fact. I would argue, I think, and I'm going to quote a colleague of mine, that what we want to be thinking about, that these considerations must be built into the product design from the start. And the risks inherent in some of the decisions to encrypt communication on Facebook Messenger need to be balanced with the risks of unencrypted communication, the risks to dissidents and people in parts of the world where they're being actively surveilled. There we go. So red teaming vulnerabilities and thinking about where and how to balance equities is critical. And I don't actually have a strong answer yet for how to think about it in the arena of privacy and financial transactions. I think it's a fascinating conversation. I think what I've learned from the people in this community and the people on MobileCoin shows that there's a really deep ethical core in thinking about what those trade-offs are going to look like as we think about mainstream adoption, as we think about mainstream use, and as we move into a world in which we choose what we're going to share and with whom, and the profound power that that gives us. We have a really unique opportunity in this moment to invent the future thoughtfully. So there are going to be negative externalities for any system. They're unavoidable. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as a society, and more directly as technologists, we are making trade-offs, and to be mindful of the direction in which we choose to go, because the devil is in the defaults. Thank you very much.